Daniel Ricciardo's time in F1 is up. 257 race starts over 14 years, 32 podiums and 8 race wins. He had a good run, but I think it's fair to say he didn't quite fully realise the potential. 2014, 16, even 2020 were all highlights, but it just never quite clicked for him, did it? Perhaps leaving Red Bull is a decision that he will reflect upon with regret, but ultimately you just never know how that would have gone if he had stayed. So I wanted to take a look back at that 2018 season. Daniel in his 7th year in F1, Max in his 4th, to fully understand how they compared at the time and whether that could have been replicated if they were teammates in 2024. My name's Tommo. Let's talk about it. Daniel Ricciardo's career will be remembered for many an individual moment. 8 race wins in his career, most of them came with a heavy dose of good vibes. 2018 saw him achieve 2 of those 8 race wins, starting off with China, a pretty comfortable win in the end, a 9-second buffer to P2, but it didn't come simply. His turbo failed in FP3, and in fact Red Bull only just got his car ready in time to set a Q1 lap where he only placed P14, 2/10 from the chop. Fortunately, he got it together for Q2, P7, and then Q3 he qualified P6 behind both Ferraris, both Mercedes, and his teammate Max. It was all to play for on Sunday. Bottas was scrapping with the Ferraris. He did a fantastic job this race. Lewis Hamilton fell back early doors, but the door opened for both Red Bulls because both Toro Rossos crashed into each other. Gasly harpooned Hartley, basically. This brought out a safety car. Max and Daniel could double stack for the yellow wall soft. Yeah, that was a thing back then. And that enabled them on the restart to make big progress from P5 and P6. But unfortunately for Max, this was one of those races where he just managed it badly, and I think a lack of maturity in his decision making bit him. First of all, he went for an overly optimistic move on Lewis Hamilton, ended up having to go way off track, and that allowed Daniel to come through. Then he put a pretty famous lunge in on Sebastian Vettel at the turn 14 hairpin, harpooned the side of him just like Gasly had done to Hartley, and spun them both out. Daniel, on the other hand, managed all of his dive bomb overtakes to absolute perfection. This was vintage Daniel late on the brakes, particularly his move on Valtteri for the lead. But then came the big one. Winning the 2018 Monaco Grand Prix was probably Daniel's most cathartic win of the 8. You've got to remember, 2 seasons prior in 2016, he had it in the bag, came into the pits, and Red Bull didn't have his tyres ready. That meant Lewis just about jumped him on the exit, demoted Daniel to P2, and that's where he'd stay. But again, that 2018 win did not come easily for him. Sure, he put it on pole, fantastic lap, and led into turn 1, but the car let him down. Not completely, but in a big way. On lap 17 of 78, he reported he was losing power. His MG UK had gone kaput. He was 160 horsepower down. Fortunately for him, for all the tracks to be missing a 1.4 litre Golf worth of power on, Monaco's the one that you take. Neither Seb or Lewis could get past him. He held him up. He was lapping like 9 seconds slower than the quickest time in Q3, but it didn't matter. He got the job done. No mistakes, had to move his brake bias way forward to compensate for the lack of an MG UK. It was a top tier performance, no question. Those are undoubtedly 2 of the most memorable moments of Daniel Ricciardo's Formula 1 career. And maybe in 2018 he may have had more, but unfortunately the car underneath him let him down far too often. There's 3 letters that summarise Daniel Ricciardo's 2018 season quite well, aren't there? DNF. Of the 21 Grand Prix that season, Daniel failed to see the checkered flag 8 times. That's a 38% DNF rate, over 1/3 of the time. Compared to the rest, well, Max in his Red Bull and Kimi in his Ferrari both retired 4 times all season each. The Mercedes of Lewis and Valtteri had 1 retirement each, both in the same race, in fact, in Austria. And even Sebastian in his Ferrari only retired once all season. That wasn't for unreliability. We all remember Germany. And of those 8 retirements all season, 6 of them were purely down to technical failures on the car. So how many points do we reckon he lost here? I'm gonna roughly approximate it. For him to lose points, that means everyone else gains those points. They always get attributed to someone, but we're gonna ballpark it. Bahrain saw his electronics conk out lap 1. He was running P4 at the time, so let's say 12 points lost. In Baku, we don't talk about Baku. that was very much on them too. In Austria, he had an exhaust failure, running P5 at the time, 10 points lost. In Germany, Daniel started at the back, having taken a grid drop for power unit components, recovered to P6, but then lost power, ironically. 8 points lost. In Belgium, Daniel got caught up in the lap 1 chaos when Hulkenberg punted Alonso over Leclerc. It swiped Daniel's rear wing as well. Red Bull did manage to change the rear wing, which is not a quick job. That put him over a lap down. He recovered somewhat, but they just ended up retiring him. In Monza, Daniel's clutch failed on lap 23, although at the time he was running outside of the points because he'd already taken a grid drop for new PU components. His 0 points lost, but that is another point, isn't it? If it wasn't for all this reliability, he wouldn't be taking as many grid drops as he was in 2018, and then giving him a much bigger task to manage on Sunday. In Austin, Daniel's battery failed on lap 8, running P4 at the time, 12 points lost. And finally, in Mexico, after putting it on pole, then running P2 behind Max, he had a hydraulic failure 10 laps from the end, 18 points lost. In total, that's roughly 60 points lost through complete unreliability, nothing to do with him. And again, that doesn't take into account that him gaining those 60 points takes them away from everyone else who benefited from his misfortune. Daniel finished the season 79 points behind Max Verstappen, so even that 60-point delta wouldn't have breached that. And also, you have to include the fact that Max also had his fair share of, well, not fair share, he had some technical problems. Bahrain, Silverstone, Hungary 3 times all season where Max's car failed through pure unreliability. There's no doubt that he was the more productive finisher of the two. In the 17 races Max finished, his average position was P3.47. Daniel, on the other hand, in the 13 he finished, only 13, average P4 exactly. Race result wise, there wasn't a huge amount in it. But what about over a lap? By 2018, Max was really starting to come into his own in terms of one lap pace. The final head-to-head qualifying stat was 15.6 in favour of Max Verstappen, but does that tell the full story? Because often it doesn't. Well, just as I broke down the Norris versus Piastri qualifying head-to-head gap, and I feel like found a more nuanced perspective within the numbers, let's do the same here. Firstly, let's look at the fastest comparable times Max and Daniel set in the furthest session they both reached. There's a few outliers with unrepresentative times and rain in Hungary, but of the 18 dry qualifying sessions, the average gap 0.186 of a second, advantage Max. Then what about all comparable laps like I did in the Norris Piastri video? That was quite contentious including that, actually. A lot of you didn't think those numbers have value. I hear your comments. I still believe they do. To fully understand the performance delta, I do think it is comparable to look at both of them setting laps in Q2, for example. As long as the context of the session is the same, you're still getting a direct comparison of how each driver pushes in those same conditions. But actually, this time around, it doesn't really change much. Comparing 65 comparable laps that I've deemed to be comparable over the course of 2018 in qualifying, the average gap 0.218, advantage Max again. What I did find interesting looking at all of these 65 comparable laps is that most of the time Max was, if not slightly beating Daniel, quite convincingly beating him. 54 of those 65, 83% of the time, Max was quicker than Daniel. So the gap was basically 2/10, which is exactly what you really look for with a clear number 1, number 2 driver combination, surely. But of course, Daniel had no interest in playing number 2 driver, and of course, unreliability affected him 6 times versus Max 3, but Max was just straight up quicker. Sure, Max was still guilty of some Verstappen-y behaviour at the time, like I mentioned in China. That was a good example. Because pace-wise, Max absolutely should have won that race, but his decision-making was lacking compared to Daniel's. But you got to remember, Max is coming in and usurping Daniel in the same way that Daniel usurped Seb in 2014. No wonder why Christian was so keen for Daniel to stay, because I'm sure he saw the writing on the wall that, hang on a second, Max is going to take over here because he could go on to be one of the greatest of all time, which I think he absolutely has. And Daniel will slot nicely within a couple of tenths and we can just take over this sport. And he left, and Red Bull have been stuck with that second seat ever since. Now, yes, Daniel's Renault announcement came with 9 races to go. It was announced at the start of August before Spa. Could that have played into Daniel's lack of one lap pace relative to Max and lack of results relative to Max? perhaps even subconsciously the team would have inevitably, shifted their focus onto Max, just like Mercedes will be shifting away from Lewis now, Ferrari shifting away from Carlos Sainz. If you know someone's leaving, you're not going to want to give them all your secrets. You got to pull that plug before they leave. Only Red Bull themselves know to what extent that may have affected results. At the end of the day, the writing was on the wall. There was no way Daniel was going to stick around, even if he hadn't left. In 2018, 2019, I don't see him overturning that deficit to Max because, well, since then, Max has only continued to get, I wouldn't say quicker over a lap. I think he was always rapid over a lap, but just becoming more complete, I guess. So then back to the most pertinent question right now. What if they ran it back? What if in 2024, rest of this year, or in 2025, who knows, right? They decided to be like, right, we're going to bring Ricciardo back in. Sorry, Checo, you've had your time and we're going to give this a go and see how Ricciardo fits in this current spec Red Bull along this current spec Max. Would Daniel still be within 0.2 on average of Max in qualifying? That is certainly the most optimistic way of looking at it, because I don't believe there's any way he would come in and be any closer to Max than he was in 2018. Does Daniel deserve that shot? And look, again, I think this gets conflated a lot. Does he deserve it? No. He's not taking that V carbohydrate by the scruff of the neck and absolutely slapped up Yuki Tsunoda, with Checo leaving the door wide open at Red Bull, by the way, and being like, you have to sign me, it's a no-brainer. I expected to come in and firmly beat Yuki. It just hasn't happened. Like, there's been periods where Daniel's been quicker, there's been periods where Yuki's been quicker. I think it's pretty equal, to be honest. But this isn't about deserving, is it? Red Bull need to make a decision based on who's going to be able to drive this specific car, this RB20, with all of its unique nuances that Max can get out of, high sensitivity that Alex has spoken about in the past. That's what matters, not who deserves it. Who will actually get the job done closer to Max, not too close, but closer to Max, enough to win Constructors' Championship, just like Bottas always held up his end of the bargain. He never lost a Constructors' Championship while he was at Mercedes. Checo is a clear number 2, and they're not going to have any Norris Piastri worries, right, in terms of them beefing, but he's too clear of a number 2 in such a way that he's also finishing 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, like he's sometimes out the points. And from a constructor's point of view, again, you use the Bottas example, he always held up his end of the bargain, and Checo can't in that Red Bull. If you had to say anyone is most deserving, you would probably have to say Yuki Tsunoda, but there's clearly reservations going on in the background. And look, there's plenty of factors that us as a fan base will not be cognizant of, because we only see the external statistics, don't we? How does he work with engineers? How does he interact with staff? Maybe they'll feel that, with Honda moving to Aston Martin, he will probably go as well, and it's not worth trying to bank on Yuki for your future. He's not the most commercially viable driver, I don't think, either. Not when you compare him to Perez and Ricciardo anyway. And look, at the end of the day, his performances in a Racing Bulls will not necessarily reflect one-to-one with how he would perform in a Red Bull. We saw that with his best mate, Pierre. Really good in Toro Rosso, really bad in Red Bull, back to Toro Rosso, really good again. That's just the way it goes sometimes. Certain cars fit certain driver style, and clearly the Toro Rosso worked better for Pierre and with his inherent characteristics than the Red Bull ever did. Liam, I have belief in. I think he would do a better job than Checo in that Red Bull for 3 main reasons. Firstly, he's proven he can jump into a Formula 1 car and hit the ground running as a rookie with very little. I mean, that Zandvoort performance was so impressive, how late he was called up, how mad the conditions were, and he kept it clean. Not to mention he consistently performed for his 5 races at least a good level. Secondly, we've seen Behrman and Colapinto come in and prove that these young drivers are well prepared now, more so you can argue than they used to be with all the FP1 sessions. They do all the old car running, which is unlimited, and you can race, as long as it's 2 seasons prior, you're allowed to test that to your heart's content. And thirdly, he's green, not literally, of course. He doesn't know anything else other than the Red Bull / V carbohydrate style of car. And of course that didn't work for Pierre Gasly, right? He'd only driven a Toro Rosso and then got into the Red Bull and it didn't work out. But I like to think that Red Bull will have learned from their mistakes and prepared Liam in such a way that he fundamentally, at 22 years of age, understands what this Red Bull needs from it and can, nurture his driving style in that direction, more so than Checo for sure, because Checo's got a learned style. You could maybe make the argument for Yuki as well. If they've never taken him serious for the Red Bull seat, then what's the point in trying to get Yuki, you know, being able to drive the Red Bull style versus the V-carb style? And then of course there is Daniel. Look, I know 2018 was a long time ago. I know that comment's going to be rife in the comment section down below, and make sure you put yours because I want to hear them all. Again, the most optimistic way to look at it is that Daniel will be 0.2 off of Max. The problem is that there's no guarantee it's going to be 0.2. It could be 3, it could be 4, it could be 5, it could be worse. And if it's 4, 5/10, it's not much of an upgrade on Checo. I believe it would probably be around between 2 and 3. I don't think Daniel's lost his ability overnight. They know how to get the best out of him, and I think they would. I can say it's a shame, and I'd love to know how he would have done in this Red Bull, but he's not entitled to it. Not just banking off of past glory in the Red Bull. He came in, he wasn't able to prove that he could do the job. I think he has proven that he's not a particularly adaptable driver. He was really good in Red Bull, really good in Renault, very inconsistent in McLaren, very inconsistent in this Racing Bulls. Who knows what version of Daniel would get in the Red Bull. I think it would be good. I think it would be better than Checo, but actually I probably would say Liam is the one I'd have the most faith in. Anyway, like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you're new and you want to see more. My name's Tommo, thanks again, have a good one, ta-da.